begin with a security check. There's no spies from Tom Watson around looking for trots. Because the truth is that I was, let me confess this to you, a member of the dreaded Revolutionary Socialist League alongside Ted Grant and Peter Taft in the 60s. And in fact, the talk I'm going to give is based on a document which I wrote while a member of said sinister Trotskyist organisation. For those of you who don't know, the Revolutionary Socialist League was a secretive Trotskyist entryist group behind the paper which became the Militant in, I think, 64 or 65. And in 68, I think it was, at a conference of the Revolutionary Socialist League, I produced a document on exactly this topic, the Labour Party and the Russian Soviets, for which I was immediately expelled. My differences with the Militant were kind of subtle. So I probably need to explain a little bit before getting into the talk. The Militant then, as now, were arguing for a Labour government which would pass an enabling act and nationalise, I think it was at that point, the 400 monopolies, maybe 350 monopolies. And they made it very clear that you'd need an enabling act in order to deal with the opposition from maybe the monarchy, the generals, the state, to expropriating the ruling class without compensation. So, all right, fair enough, that was okay. But I was interested in the implications, kind of what then, and what happens if, as was fairly obvious, what happens if the leaders of this Labour Party in Parliament who form the government don't do that? And the answer was always that we were only asking for the Labour leadership to pass this enabling act and do these things because we knew that they wouldn't do them, and the point then would be to split and take the power and do all the necessary legislation in the name of the Revolutionary Party, whatever that came to be called at that moment. And I kept thinking, it doesn't quite add up. I mean, if you've managed to get a majority in the Labour Party sufficient to get this programme through maybe Labour Party conference, and you've got this huge groundswell demanding this programme, why would you, at that point, leave on the basis of something predictable anyway, which namely that the leaders of the Labour Party at that point would probably vacillate at the very least? Why would you split and go away and form your Revolutionary Party and then take the power, take state power, conquer power, organise your insurrection, hopefully not too bloody? Why would you do all that in the name of the Revolutionary Party? Why not, if you've got this majority in the Labour Party, why not do it in the name of the traditional organisation of the British working class, namely the Labour Party? And there was never an answer to that. And the more I thought about it, the more it became clear to me that the militant tendency, like the Socialist Workers' Party, like all the various other groups, sort of, their work in the Labour Party is a kind of smash and grab raid. You go into the party, you make a noise, you get support, and then you pull everyone away and you form your own party. And it was never clear what exactly happens then. Do you then stand candidates on a parliamentary basis in the name of your Revolutionary Party until you've now got a majority all over again? It was never very clear. And because I should perhaps just say in sort of brackets, I was educated to a large extent by Alan Woods. Alan Woods and I were studying Russian. We were in the Russian Studies department at Sussex University. And I must say Alan was absolutely brilliant. And made me read Hegel for a start, made me read about, got me to read Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. I took it all very, very seriously, as did Alan. By the way, for those of you who don't know, Alan Woods he's just finished the new translation of Trotsky's biography of Stalin, and he's in a different wing now from Peter Taft. He's in the socialist appeal side of things. But I've got a huge amount of admiration for Alan Woods. And in fact, everything I know as a Marxist, I would say I learned, pretty much everything I learned in that brief period of mine when I was in the Revolutionary Socialist League, and particularly owe a lot to Arnold Woods. So I studied Trotsky, and in particular read several times his History of the Russian Revolution. So let me just say, I don't think there are two Trotskys like there are two Chomskys. There's only one Leon Trotsky, but still, you can say that the Leon Trotsky who was the chairman of the Petrograd Soviet in 1905, and the Leon Trotsky who organised, in many ways organised, the actual nuts and bolts of the insurrection of October 1917, was in a different position, in a different context, and therefore doing things differently from the Leon Trotsky who crushed the Kronstadt Rebellion, and the Leon Trotsky that attempted to form a Fourth International, and to which most of the different Trotskyist groups owe allegiance. My allegiance was and is to the Leon Trotsky, whose genius it was to find a way of organising what to this day remains, I think it's true to say, well it is, isn't it, the only wholly working class, wholly internationalist insurrection, conquest of power that we've experienced so far. And it does seem to me rather important that we learn the lessons of that success. I heard Peter Taff on Channel 4. Did anyone else hear it last night on Channel 4? He was being pressed about this, and he was forced to say, quite correctly I think, don't keep on about Leon Trotsky and stuff. That was October 1917. This is Britain 2016, and we're in a different situation. Of course we're in a different situation. But what's important is like how different. We need to specify with precision the differences between the labour movement as it's evolved historically in this country and the labour movement as it evolved historically in Russia, in order to work out with some precision what the differences are. Because it's no good just saying it's different and therefore we can't learn anything from history. We have to know with some precision what the differences between that situation and our own situation are. And then perhaps the most important thing, I'm giving a sort of bullet point preview of what I'm going to be arguing. The genius of Leon Trotsky, in my view, was this. He knew, and we all know, that there's nothing more illegal than an insurrection. It's hard to think of anything more legal than organising to overthrow the state and winning state power on that basis, facing up to the army, and so forth. Nothing could be more illegal than that. But what Trotsky did was find a quote legal way of doing it. By that I mean, in the eyes of the masses, it was Kornilov, it was the counter-revolutionaries who were illegal, and the Soviets, and taking power in the name of the Soviets, was the establishment of sovereignty by the legally constituted organs of the working class. So in the eyes of the masses, this was the defence of legality and not an illegal act. So I've always thought, somehow or other, if we're going to win a revolution in this country, it has to be perceived as, and maybe in a profound way be, a legal insurrection. In a profound way, by what I mean is our insurrection will be more legal than the supposed legality of the Queen in Parliament, the generals, and all that stuff. We would be defending, it's like our law versus theirs, but our law would have more validity in the eyes of the masses as we're organising. And of course, when you think about it, we're in a situation which is interesting now. There is a possibility that the coup, which has been around for a few weeks, months in this country, on the part of MPs, obviously representing the bourgeoisie within the Labour Party, the attempted coup that they've been trying to perpetrate against the democratically elected leadership of the Labour Party, this won't be the end of it. There'll be this coup, another coup, another coup. We've got like a series of coups, possibly each coup deeper in the state, to prevent what those of us who support this new movement in the Labour Party want, which is to build a social movement, actually in my case, a revolutionary social movement, which will come to office, win a majority in Parliament, and on that basis, but not just through Parliament, take power. And as soon as you think about it, if you think that these attempted coups aren't going to just disappear. The ruling class aren't going to be happy, oh well, we lost that one, maybe it's a legal case against them or whatever it was, okay, pack it in and let Labour come to power on a basis which might lead to getting out of NATO, which might lead to second thoughts about Trident. Of course they won't. And we know, don't we, from last year, from when Jeremy Corbyn did win the leadership, immediately, within days, we were hearing about rumblings and mumblings from generals, making it absolutely clear that they wouldn't allow a Labour government under Jeremy Corbyn to withdraw from NATO, to abolish Trident. Wouldn't allow? The message could hardly be clearer. They would invoke the Queen in Parliament to take measures to restore stability and order, as they would put it. And that would be the coup among, the culminating attempted coup following all the other coups. And we're already witnessing, the beginnings of such a process orchestrated by the state or agents of the state in our own movement. So all I'm saying is, if we had a majority in Parliament, we would have every right to take power, wouldn't we? I say we, the movement, the working class movement. With a majority in Parliament, we would have the right, the legal right, to take power, regardless of what the general said. So just resisting that coup would actually bring us to a position where the question of power would be posed. So that's kind of in a nutshell what I'm going to be arguing. And actually, by the way, I don't think that, I hope and I don't think there's going to be any particular differences, maybe on some details, between what I'm saying and what the comrades in this room have been arguing for the last year. Because I've been reading the Weekly Worker every week, and I find it brilliant. I find the arguments against the SWP and the various other people outside the Labour Party, that they're supporting Corbyn from outside the Labour Party, I find, they don't carry any weight. They're ludicrous arguments. And I completely solidarise with the position put forward by the Weekly Worker on that issue. To be supporting this new movement, you have to be inside this massive framework called the Labour Party. There's still, I just want to sort of clarify, the reason for this talk is to kind of clarify where that leads at the end of the day. Are we still thinking in terms of building a revolutionary party, getting out of the Labour Party, and then conquering power in the name of a revolutionary party? Or are we thinking of something a little bit more subtle and actually a little bit closer to what happened in Russia in 1917? Soviets. It would be hard to think of any two forms of organisation more different in so many deep structural, political, ideological respects than the Russian Soviets of, say, 1905 on the one hand, and the British Labour Party on the other. I mean, there's opposite ends of the spectrum, opposite poles as you could possibly imagine. The one, the Soviets, direct organs of workers' power. Actually, in 1905, of course, they were strike committees, essentially. And those strike committees, those Soviets, were not forming a movement within an already established Russian parliamentary system, because there wasn't one. So the Soviets were fulfilling working class functions, but at the same time, it was only while the Soviets were powerful that you had any kind of even bourgeois democracy. So instead of forming themselves within an already constituted parliament as one of the parties within that bourgeois parliament, the Soviets were the only show in town, the only parliament. The Soviets were a workers' parliament in and of themselves. Whereas, of course, in Britain, we've had at the absolute opposite extreme. We've had a situation where you have had strike committees, you have had trade unions, you have had these co-ops, trades councils and so on forming, sometimes under conditions of strikes, even a general strike, of course, in 26, but all the time constrained and structured within not just a parliament, but really the oldest parliamentary system and framework in Europe. A very stable, entrenched, flexible, resilient parliamentary system, which of course then had effects on the way in which the whole structure was organised. But despite that, despite those differences, there are also intriguing similarities. And I want to perhaps read again, this is from my document, the one I got expelled for all those years ago. This is quoting from Lenin. V.I. Lenin at the Second Congress of the Communist International, 1920. and he's talking about the Labour Party here. It must be borne in mind that the British Labour Party is in a particularly peculiar position. It is a very original sort of party, or more correctly, it is not a party at all in the ordinary sense of the word. It is made up of the members of trade unions with a membership of about 4 million and allows sufficient liberty to all the affiliated political parties. Such peculiar conditions, this is Lenin, now prevail, of course that was then in 1920, not now, although things could change of course. Anyway, such peculiar conditions now prevail in Britain that if a political party wishes, it may remain a revolutionary workers' party, notwithstanding the fact that it is connected with a peculiar labour organisation of 4 million members, which is half trade union and half political and is headed by bourgeois leaders. Under such circumstances, it would be a great mistake if the best revolutionary elements did not do everything possible to remain in such a party. So Lenin was, at that time, well aware of the peculiarities of the British Labour Party, and I suppose the main point is this, is that across the rest of the continent, the social democratic parties were fundamentally political, fundamentally programmatic, fundamentally ideological, if you like, and that applied in Russia as well. And they, having formed themselves on a political and ideological basis, then reached out to form a movement. So that across Europe, most of the social democratic parties were fundamentally ideological parties. And they were ideological, except obviously in Russia, where there wasn't a parliament, ideological formation within a pre-existing parliament. In Britain, the extra-parliamentary dimension of the Labour Party was there from the beginning, because from the beginning, the Labour Party was the trade unions, or sections of the trade unions, sensing the need to have direct representation in Parliament. So, as everyone knows, I think it was in 1900, the Doncaster branch of the Locomotive Engineers Union put forward a resolution to the TUC demanding the formation of a Labour Representation Committee. And the TUC conference debated this, and agreed, formed the Labour Representation Committee. That's quite simply a committee to represent Labour in Parliament. And in 1906, on the basis of some election victories, formed the Labour Party. So the Labour Party in this country came from outside Parliament. It came from the unions, and then from that basis, the idea was to get into Parliament and then fight for working class interests within the Parliament. So the point I'm making is that identity does connect with, despite the opposition, despite the contrast with the Russian Soviets. And the reason why the Russian Soviets and the British Labour Party are so fundamentally different in pretty much every way is because the history of Britain and the history of Russia were so fundamentally different. In Britain had the first of the many bourgeois revolutions which you see across Europe. We had our bourgeois revolution in 1640, 1649, when the head of King Charles was chopped off, of course. And that established, obviously with some rocky patches and some toing and froing, established a bourgeois parliament. And because it was so early, because that revolution was so early, it occurred when there really wasn't a working class, it meant a very stable bourgeois parliamentary system. And of course led to the British bourgeoisie becoming the most powerful in the world. Whereas, of course, in Russia, you had the last of the series of bourgeois revolutions. You can say Britain, 1640, France, 1789, Germany, 1848. As you go across from Britain, the west part of Europe, over to the east, each revolution comes later. And as it comes later, so the proportion of power of the bourgeoisie relative to the proletariat is less. So in France, you had beginnings of a revolutionary working class, and the revolution went further. In Germany, as Marx was pointing out, of course, in the German Revolution in 1840, the proletariat was so strong compared with the bourgeoisie that the bourgeoisie took fright and sided with the aristocracy, the reaction, the monarchists, against that revolution. And of course, in Russia, that dynamic went even further, with the bourgeoisie absolutely totally scared of any kind of democracy, and it left the working class alone to carry out not only its own class tasks, but the tasks of the bourgeoisie. So in Russia in 1905, insofar as there was any democracy of any kind, it was because the working class had organised a general strike and were sovereign across the cities, across the major cities and industrial areas. So what I'm saying there is that if you're asking why does the British Labour Party, is it so parliamentary, it's because in Britain the parliamentary system was very strong, and why in Russia was a similar incipient class organisation, namely workers on strike forming unions, forming strike committees. Why in Russia did they actually replace the parliament? Well, I've just explained, and of course this isn't at all original. It's exactly what Marx wrote and Engels wrote about 1848. The reason for the differences are, of course, the differences in history. Now, having seen that, yes, perhaps I should just read out from here. Do you mind me just reading out for a little bit? I don't usually read stuff. But, the Labour Party and the Soviet structures have little in common. The Labour Party is a definite political party competing against openly bourgeois parties for votes and for representation in the bourgeois parliament. It is a bureaucratic organisation with a middle-class outlook, and it excludes communists and other socialists from its ranks because of their political views. The Soviets, however, were not a political party, but simply a mass working-class arena and parliament for the participation of all parties within it. The Soviet did not compete with openly bourgeois parties on their terms for seats in a bourgeois parliament. It was itself its own working-class parliament, taking the place of a bourgeois parliament altogether. The fact is, however, as a historical analysis will show, that Britain's Labour Party, although different from the Russian Soviet, has developed in place of, instead of, the Soviet as it developed in Russia. To put it another way, the Labour Party occupies the same space or place in class society as did the Soviet. The differences are to be explained by the differences between British and Russian class society. The explanation for the super-democracy of the Soviets is simple. They were performing not only working-class functions, they were performing also the functions performed by bourgeois parliaments and assemblies in the earlier history of Western Europe. The absence of a real bourgeoisie in Russia meant that there could not exist in that country even bourgeois democracy except within the framework of workers' institutions. And so instead of a parliament, they developed in Russia in 1905 and 1917 a mass of workers' councils, people to a large extent by petty bourgeois radicals who had nowhere else to go. So now, I want to now make the point which Trotsky makes so emphatically in his History of the Russian Revolution, that we can far too easily feel that there's nothing to be learned from the Russian Soviets, nothing to be learned from the Russian Revolution, because everything's so different. And then we have this this kind of romantic view of the Russian Soviets, as if they were somehow pure organs of working class democracy. I mean, they were organs of working class democracy, but the idea that they were pure, and in that sense utterly different from the hugely bourgeois contaminated organs of the British working classes, is a huge mistake. And perhaps the easiest way to express this is to say that when Soviets arise in this country, they won't have a label on them saying these are the Soviets, And even in Russia, of course, what did Soviets mean? The words, I learned a bit of Russian. I've pretty much forgotten all of it, but I had to learn a bit of Russian while I was in Sussex, and in fact did. And the verb to advise is Sovietovach, and Soviet is to advise. So these were advisory bodies. And when you think about it, they were kind of talk shops in theory. They were for talking and advising other people what to do, in terms of legislation and stuff. And of course the word parliament comes from parler, to talk in French. So on that just etymological level, there's not too much difference. The Soviets were for advising or talking, if you like, much as parliaments are. What Trotsky realised was something which Lenin at first didn't. So let's just go back. Does anyone know? I'm sure you do. So it's a bit of a rhetorical question. What was Lenin's attitude towards the Soviets in 1905?
Trick.
It's all a trick. And in fact, Lenin called them police Soviets. He called them the police. He argued that the Soviets were organised by the Tsarist police, and he didn't go near them. So while Lenin was being a sectarian, let's face it, a real sectarian, Trotsky became chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. And all right, I mean, both had right on their side. Lenin was right to build a party, but Trotsky was right to join the Soviets and become hugely active as the chairman of the Petrograd Soviet. So luckily, by 1917, Lenin had kind of learnt that the Soviets, are a massive framework within which any revolutionary party has to be organised, has to be operating. So, as you know, April comes back from Finland Station, announces the April thesis, and puts forward the slogan, all power to the Soviets. The power must be transferred to the Soviets. Now, if you're not careful, and you don't read Trotsky or some other history with a certain amount of respect and diligence, you'll think it was a kind of an obvious slogan. All power to the Soviets, of course, all power to the Soviets. Well, it actually wasn't, of course, because what were the Soviets? Now, the point was really that in 1917, after the February Revolution, the Soviets were not really as revolutionary. They were not the same organisations as they had been in 1905. So in a way you had a paradox, that when the Soviets really were strike committees, they were direct organs of workers' power, Lenin wasn't too keen on them. But in 1917 he was a lot more keen, when in fact the Soviets were, there was a strike, of course. The women started the strike, didn't they, on International Women's Day, 1917. But the strike, didn't turn into a general strike and wasn't maintained in the way that 1905 was maintained. So the Russian Soviets in 1917 were a kind of memory of the earlier Soviets, but really they were, you could argue that the Soviets were Menshevik. Well, they certainly were Menshevik. They were led by the Mensheviks. But you could argue that the Soviets in 1917 were socialist revolutionary, petty bourgeois. Yes, you could argue, and in fact they were. So, Trotsky had actually come to the idea of all part of the Soviets a little bit before Lenin. Lenin, it was obviously him as a revolutionary who had to put forward the slogan all part of the Soviets. But I just need to once again remind comrades, I know probably most of you know this, so apologies if you do know all this already, but maybe some of the younger comrades don't know this, and so at any rate it's important to remind ourselves of these facts. So, according to Trotsky himself, he's writing now the history of the Russian Revolution, or he's writing the transitional program as a shortened version of that history contained in it. According to Trotsky himself, the Bolsheviks took the power in October 1917 through the strategy of calling on their opponents, Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, to take the power. It was upon the demand, take the power, addressed to the official leadership, that the Bolsheviks mobilized their support to take the power themselves. So it's like saying, take the power, you can take the power, you've got the masses behind you, you can break with the provisional government, you can get rid of the capitalist ministers, you can, all that stuff, take the power, or make way for those of us who will. That was the essence of the demand. So, and this is just a quote from Trotsky. From April to September 1917, the Bolsheviks demanded that the social revolutionists and Mensheviks break with the liberal bourgeoisie and take power into their own hands. And then he goes on to say, the demand of the Bolsheviks addressed to the Mensheviks and the SRs, break with the bourgeoisie, take the power into your own hands, had for the masses tremendous educational significance. The obstinate unwillingness of the Mensheviks and SRs to take power, so dramatically exposed during the July days, definitely doomed them before mass opinion and prepared the victory of the Bolsheviks. And that's the point, isn't it? It's like, politics is about power. We keep hearing this now, don't we, with the Jeremy Corbyn, Owen Smith thing, about whether politics is about power or not. Us lot get accused, maybe there's some truth in it, in some of being interested in progress and not power, or just principles and not power. Well, I'm sorry, the people I know, we're very much interested in power. And if you think about it, Jeremy, as John MacDonald said, he's like made of steel. I mean, he may not be talking about power the whole time, but he's certainly sticking on in there, and it's clearly a battle for power within the Labour Party. So now let's refine this a little bit. The specific organ which the Bolsheviks in their resolutions called upon to take the power was the Executive Committee of the Soviet. The slogan, all power to the Soviets, was concretely the demand that the whole power pass to this organ. It was chosen simply because it was recognised as their highest class organ by the masses themselves, and hence was actually in a position to take power. Although, as a body composed of Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, it was very reluctant to pull the strings of power, it at least had these strings in its hands. In other words, there's no point demanding that some group take the power if they can't. So you have to demand that this action get taken by whoever is in a position, theoretically, to do it. So you have to address the demand to the leadership. So opposition to the demand that it seize power came from two opposite directions. The anarchists and radicals on the extreme ultra-left saw the Soviet and its EC, Executive Committee, as simply a direct instrument of the capitalists, the landlords and the war machine. Confusing it with the capitalist state apparatus, they thought it had too much power already. From the right-wing social revolutionaries, the Mensheviks and some centrist Bolsheviks, came opposition on the grounds that the Soviets were doing fine and had all the power they needed for the present. If they accepted that the full power should at some date be taken, they pushed this date far off into the indefinite future. Now, I just wanted to read out Trotsky's description. So the point I'm making is that it wasn't that easy to do this strange thing. Why would you ask your opponents to take power? I mean, surely you're against your opponents. What do you want them to take power for? But you have to do that. If you're not yet in a position to take power, and they are, and you want to raise the question of power as the nub of the matter, the crucial issue, the question of power, you've got no choice but to demand that the power be taken by whoever is in a position to do it. And in this case, in Russia in 1917, it was actually very difficult because, in a real sense, the so-called Soviet Executive Committee was a fraud perpetrated upon the masses. And Trotsky writes, okay, fraud is perhaps a bit strong, but Trotsky doesn't mince his words. The organisation created on February the 27th in the Tauride Palace and called Executive Committee of the Soviet and Workers' Deputies had little really in common with its name. The Soviet and Workers' Deputies in 1905, the originator of the system, rose out of a general strike. It directly represented the masses in struggle. The leaders of the strike became the deputies of the Soviet. The selection of its membership was carried out under fire. Its Executive Committee was elected by the Soviet for the further prosecution of the struggle. It was this Executive Committee which placed on the order of the day the armed insurrection. The February Revolution, thanks to the revolt of the troops, was victorious before the workers had created a Soviet. The Executive Committee was self-constituted in advance of the Soviet and independently of the factories and regiments after the victory of the revolution. We have here, writes Trotsky, the classic initiative of the radicals, standing aside from the revolutionary struggle, but getting ready to harvest its fruit. The radical intelligentsia got ready its reserve sub-government at the moment of the February victory. Inasmuch as they had been, at least in the past, adherent to the workers' movement and inclined to cover themselves with its tradition, they now named their offspring Executive Committee of the Soviet. And of course we know, those of you who know the history of that period, that this Executive Committee of the Soviet, in the July days, was responsible for shooting a huge demonstration of Bolsheviks demanding all power of the Soviets. So you have to picture this dialectical contradiction. Here we are, this contradiction. Here we are, we're marching towards the Tauride Palace. In there is the Executive Committee. We're demanding that they take the power, and they're shooting us. It's as bad as that. And as a result of that, Lenin said, okay, forget it. The Soviets are now so reactionary, so counter-revolutionary, supporting the war, shooting us and all the rest of it, that we can't, it's ludicrous, doesn't make any sense to be calling on this organisation to take the power. Again, I hope comrades are familiar with this fact, that Lenin considered the slogan of all power of the Soviets bankrupt after the July days, when a severe reaction set in with the threat of the Kornilov revolt and so forth. Lenin wrote an article on slogans where he insisted the future insurrection, which has to be soon, he wasn't putting off in the definite future, will have to be carried out not in the name of the Soviets. This is Lenin's mistake, by the way. It was a mistake. Not in the name of the Soviets, but in the name of the Bolsheviks. He was arguing that we Bolsheviks, in our own name, will have to organise an insurrection. Trotsky wasn't sure about that. In fact, Trotsky was pretty damn sure that this was only, this huge phase of reaction was only a temporary phase. And it was really Trotsky who saw the opportunity to call, and just very briefly what happened was you have the Kornilov revolt, the Soviets feel under threat, Trotsky is able to persuade the leadership of the Soviets, now really under threat, and like they're going to get shot if there's a Kornilov counter-revolution, the Kornilov marches on Petrograd, and set up what's called a military revolutionary committee. Now, this military revolutionary committee did become the organ of the armed insurrection, but Trotsky didn't need to, Lenin didn't need to be calling for armed insurrection. It was couched entirely defensively. To defend the revolution, to defend the democracy, we had to set up a military revolutionary committee. To defend ourselves, against a Tsarist or autocratic military coup. And in the course of that, resistance against this imminent coup came the groundswell of support for the Bolsheviks on the basis now of the demand for all power of the Soviets, given that the Soviets themselves were coming under the influence of the Bolsheviks. So the most brilliant thing, in my view, and again if you read the history of the Russian Revolution, I'm not saying anything at all original, Trotsky is saying this himself, was to do the following. What was the sovereign organ, if you like, of parliament in that period? You didn't have a Duma. Insofar as you had a parliament, it was the Soviets. They were the only effective parliament that existed. So why not call a Congress of the Soviets? This was the genius on the ground of Lenin Trotsky at that point. Call what was the Second Congress of Soviets. Hold it right in the middle of Petrograd. Make sure that that Congress is protected. Make sure that all the soldiers who want to defend their parliament, their Congress of Soviets, are present not to organize an insurrection, but to defend against the threat of being disbanded by Kornilov. Merely in defending the proceedings of that conference, merely in making sure that it wasn't disbanded, making sure there were enough soldiers on the side of this parliament to defend that. By parliament I mean, of course, the Congress of Soviets, the only parliament you had. Make sure that that Congress was allowed to carry out its proceedings. That was the insurrection. The survival of that Congress of Soviets through that crisis was the insurrection, because once you defended that Soviet against everything that was being thrown at it, you found yourself with power in your hands, and that's how it was done. So the parallel would be, I mean, again, you can say, do we need a parallel? Well, I think so. I think we need to learn from the Russian Revolution how to do it, myself. Maybe I'm a bit old-fashioned. Maybe I'm a Trotskyist. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm one of those sinister people trying to manipulate everybody. But to me, power is important. And in order to win power, you have to know how you do it. And you can't do it by advocating violence. You can't do it by advocating insurrection. You can do it defensively, by advocating the defence against a military coup of parliamentary sovereignty, or the sovereignty of the labour movement. So the parallel would be, okay, how do I put this? Yeah, I know what I'm going to do. Okay, I'm making a prediction. Maybe a bit rash, but you can only make predictions about the future if you're kind of part of the future, can't you? I mean, you can predict what you might be doing if you're part of it. You can't just predict the future, because it always goes wrong. You haven't got a crystal ball. But my prediction is that the slogan of the imminent British Revolution. Wait, I should get it right. Get it right way up. It's going to be right. It mustn't be upside down. It'd be catastrophically inauspicious if it's up wrong way down. There we go. Can you read it? What does it say?
Yes. All powers to Labour governments.
Now, this doesn't look really revolutionary now, but imagine there's a military coup. Okay? Imagine we've got Jeremy Corbyn in charge of the Labour government, and we're trying to implement our programme. We're trying to get out of NATO, abolish Trident, defend ourselves, and then meanwhile there's rumblings from the generals. Now listen, I'm not sure it would be more than rumblings. I don't think the generals in this country, or the Queen, or that thing, I'm not sure they quite have the nerve to do an Allende and crush our movement. I mean, let's not be fools. I mean, they would probably want to do it. But whether they could agree on the timing and and all that, I'm not sure. Usually what happens in a revolutionary situation is that we, the revolutionaries, we're thinking together, organising together, finding our solidarity, and it is the enemy class that are at sixes and sevens, vacillating, unsure of what to do. And of course it's when the generals, when the officers are feeling uncertain how to instruct their troops, that's the kind of conditions you need in order for the troops to think, well, we're getting contradictory orders, they don't seem to know what they're doing, maybe we need to start thinking for ourselves. So I'm simply saying that if we had, and it's a bit of an if, I mean obviously there's many a slip between cup and lip. We could, I don't know, has anyone heard what happened with this legal ruling today? I don't know what's happened yet.
3 o'clock.
Sorry?
3 o'clock.
3 o'clock, okay. But I mean, assuming these attempted coups continue, we've had coup number 1, complete flop. Coup number 2, who knows? I know this particular legal judgment isn't absolutely decisive, is it? We'd probably still win the election anyway. But obviously, insofar as we now have, if we have a Labour Party under Corbyn with nearly all the MPs disappearing and having to reselect, we're going to have lots and lots of different, maybe 5 coups, 6 coups, 7 coups, 9 coups, I don't know, but as long as we keep resisting these coups, my image now is that we finally reached the culminating coup when we actually got a Labour government under Jeremy. I know it's a big if, I know it's, but anyway, we have to think big. We have to maximise whatever opportunities are around. Anyway, if we're quite, put it this way, if we're used to resisting coups, and if each time they throw another coup at us, we find more solidarity, more unity, more confidence in our strength, hopefully by the time the big coup arrives, where the military start organising manoeuvres around Heathrow with tanks or whatever it is, as they've done once before, hopefully we're so good at resisting coups, they will resist this one as well. And if so, okay, I'm just imagining things, I'm a bit wild at these things, but I mean, why not organise a huge Labour Party conference? Massive Labour Party conference. Why not hold this massive Labour Party conference, I don't know, in Parliament Square, in the middle of Liverpool, middle of Manchester, middle of Birmingham? Have a trans-spatial Labour Party conference. Have a Labour Party conference with branches all over the place, okay? And see if they want to disband it using military force. See whether the troops will be willing to do that. By the way, the troops aren't that happy for all sorts of reasons. Over Blair in Iraq, housing on all the shop, Catterick. Appeal to the troops. It's worth a try. Okay, that's it. Okay, well, I thought those contributions were very clarifying and brilliant, actually. And I can't think of anything I'd really disagree with. I mean, I didn't have time to say everything, obviously, about peasants in the Russian Revolution. I didn't have everything. I didn't even mention the Constituent Assembly. So it's great that collectively we fill in the gaps that, of each other's contributions. The way in which I've been sort of attacked over the years has been, Chris Knight, or my colleagues in Labour Briefing, we think you can transform the Labour Party into a revolutionary party. I think we can transform the Labour Party into a revolutionary party, and that is the fundamental misconception that I want to hammer and just demolish. It's like chalk and cheese. The equivalent would be saying Trotsky thinks you can transform the Soviets into a revolutionary party. There are two completely different things. One's a form of parliament, a framework for all the different ideological strands within the working class, and the other thing is one of those strands. And I'm entirely in favour of building a communist party. I mean, my whole life I spent working on revolutionary science. I've been trying to defend Marx and Engels on dialectical materialism, on primitive communism, and now on Chomsky and stuff. I believe in science. I believe there's nothing more revolutionary and international than science. Science is the most revolutionary form of knowledge there is. And I happen to think that a revolutionary party or communist party which calls itself that and isn't based on science, isn't the political expression of that, of some kind of scientific revolution, it won't be a revolutionary party. So I get a bit cross if anyone says Chris Knight doesn't believe you need a revolutionary party. I've spent my life trying to provide the basis for, obviously with many other comrades, to build a genuine revolutionary party. My point is simply that a revolutionary party can't be built in the abstract. You can't just go off somewhere in a room and work out the programme of a revolutionary party. It won't happen. You build a party in struggle. Revolutionary consciousness, above all, talking about our revolutionary consciousness as a class, it's our consciousness of strength, our ability up. We have to feel our strength and our ability to start changing our conditions and ultimately to change the world. And what I notice about what's happening now in this country with the Corbyn thing, it's that a certain feeling of strength is developing. We seem to have lost a court case, but in a sense, who cares? I mean, it's quite important actually. But on the other hand, everything doesn't depend on a court case, but it does depend on the gradual momentum building up of people feeling, we're fed up with the entire bloody parliamentary system. It doesn't work. It's not fit for purpose. Parliament is rubbish. So, and that is a key part of what's been happening recently. So we can talk about the Constituent Assembly, we can talk about the Soviets and all that, and whether they can be counterposed or not. But the crucial thing that's happening right now in front of our eyes is that, in general, and it happens on the right as well as on the left actually, there's a disillusionment with politics and a disillusionment with the idea that MPs can solve our problems. That's the essence of what's happening around Jeremy Corbyn. Now, I agree with Tina that Jeremy is not exactly Lenin, and I agree with the other people who said somehow we're lacking in programmatic detail. But I just want to say, to me, I mean, the point about Jeremy is that he's hopeless. He doesn't sing God Save the Queen. He doesn't wear a tie properly. He doesn't even make proper speeches in Parliament. He's not there when you need him. Theresa May's just become Prime Minister and he's looking after the allotment or something. But the crucial point about all that is that you can believe in him. You believe he's Jeremy and he's not going to shift. And the point about everybody else, and I think it's a really important point, is with young people, particularly young people, is that in this digital age of Facebook and Twitter and all these copies and copies and copies of various things going on, there's an increasing feeling that what exactly is true beneath it all, what's authentic, what's real behind all these MPs and politicians and Facebooks and all this stuff, advertising and stuff. And whereas Owen Smith, you know he's a big pharma lobbyist, and if he suddenly says he wants a socialist revolution, you don't believe a word of it. Whatever it is that Jeremy says, you kind of believe it. And the fact is, he's a placeholder. As long as Jeremy's up there, it's not some other charismatic politician like Tony Blair or some other bastard being there instead. And what it does, in my view, it means that the rest of us have to step up to the plate. I agree that Jeremy hasn't got all the answers, but then the point is that actually is an invitation to comrades here in this room to come up with some more of the answers that Jeremy isn't actually providing. So if it needs a lot of stuff on science, on climate science, on, I don't know, various things about what to do with different, in the Middle East, and I don't know, all sorts of things, these things, I'm actually not too keen on looking for, I mean, I'm not saying anyone here in this room is doing that, but I mean, the crucial disillusionment is disillusionment with charismatic politicians. Do we really need, in this moment, like a charismatic Bolshevik? I'm a little bit sceptical about that. I'm not quite sure that we do. I think there's a strong feeling in favour of a kind of collective self-organisation and self-leadership. And in that context, Jeremy's brilliant, because by being in a sense hopeless, while at the same time somebody you can absolutely believe in, and shifting responsibility for all the details of the programme to the rest of us, the prospect of a genuinely communist, genuinely collectivist self-leadership, if you like, leadership, becomes more realistic. But I do want to stress, I'm absolutely in favour of a communist party. And whether it gets called the Communist Party is not the issue, is it, surely? I mean, you know, it could come in, what's going on? There's a very loud noise in the room. So I'm totally in favour of a communist party. But the crucial thing is the relationship between the party and the wider structures. Trotsky said again and again and again, the task of revolution can only be solved by a particular combination between the party, the revolutionary party, and a Soviet-like structure, the Soviet structure or some other equivalent. And it seems to me that we all pretty much agree with that. Now, Tina made another very important point, which is to say, apparently I was saying, or interpreted as saying, that we don't come out with a full programme, we're just defensive, we're just defending ourselves against coup. I mean, that is very far from, Tina, from what I'm thinking. I mean, it's absolutely clear that we need a full programme. I mean, that's what I've been doing all my life. I've been trying to present a vision of communism as something we will return to, and bring the idea of science as something which is actually going to, you know, real science, genuine science, self-organised science, what scientists call science, as actually exciting and thrilling and futuristic, and the basis for any future communist party. So I'm not at all saying that you just defend, but what I am saying is, I don't think, and I imagine you'd agree with me, that advocating violence is a particularly good idea. I just think, you know, there's a lot of violence going on in the Middle East, a lot of violence all over the place, bombs going off and stuff. I just think any idea, and of course, you may, I mean, to me it's self-evident that you're not advocating violence, and I'm not advocating violence. But of course, we saw that with Peter Taff. Did you remember last night? I'm not a fan of Peter Taff, but I mean, he made a few interesting points simply by kind of stating the obvious. But the interviewer kept on saying, "You're a revolutionary, therefore you're in favour of violence." And you know, he replied quite correctly. Of course, we're not in favour of violence, but we are in favour of resisting violence. And that means, of course, if you're trying to resist violence, you have to be able to crack down on violence, which means a certain amount of coercive power on your side, including support within, the police, the army, and the rest of it. So it's about how do you pose the questions. Now, I do agree with the Weekly Worker. I think the issue of the very existence of the standing army is an important one. No standing army, just the armed populace. It's a pretty damn good slogan. Get rid of the monarchy, all those things. I've always supported those things, and I probably agree with you that we should be, open about it. I'm perfectly open about all these things, but I don't think you mobilise the class. Partly you mobilise the class by having a vision, but I don't think categoric demands to abolish the army are going to mobilise the resources to do that, to get rid of a standing army. I don't think putting at the top of your programme abolish the monarchy is going to build up the forces to actually, in real life, get rid of the monarchy. So what I'm saying is that, with any luck, the opposition are their own gravediggers. What I'm saying is that if the monarchy is perceived to be, because it's actually being used by the ruling elites to organise some kind of coup, with generals moving tanks around under the Queen, and the Queen in Parliament decides that in the interest of national security the government's got to be disbanded or dismissed, then you've got a situation where you have the monarchy standing openly and explicitly in opposition to what the mass of the people regard as the sovereign institution, namely a Labour government in Parliament. So if the Queen's now perceived to be against, with the generals against Parliament, that puts the onus of illegality on them, and it makes it much easier for us to pose ourselves as, and actually to be the guardians of, if you like, genuine sovereignty, genuine democracy, genuine legality. So a defensive framework is the best way of doing things, and of course that is exactly what Trotsky did in the Russian Revolution. The slogan wasn't insurrection now or even revolution now, it was all part of the Soviets, which were the only legitimate parliament of that period. All right, you had the Constituent Assembly, but it hadn't even been held yet. As of now, between February and October, insofar as there was a democracy, were organs of democracy, they were those Soviet organs, and the slogan, all part of the Soviets, meant all power should go to them, as opposed to unelected capitalists, military people, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that a defensive way of posing these questions is the best one, but of course that doesn't exclude a vision, a communist vision for the future. So, and then finally, on the question of the Revolutionary Party, how do we put this? It's yes, it was Mike, wasn't it, that said that Lenin was kind of a bit wrong, because by 1920 the bans of prescriptions were getting reinstated inside the Labour Party. But, at the moment, Jeremy, Diane Abbott, John McDonnell, people are not saying, right now, remove the bans of prescriptions so that Peter Taft can join the Labour Party with his organisation intact. But, on the other hand, the argument that we have got the Fabian Society, we have got the Co-ops, we have got Progress, we have these various other factions or organisations within the Labour Party, seems to be a pretty strong argument that a really democratic Labour Party, under Jeremy, would remove bans of prescriptions. In which case, of course, this group, the Communist Party of Great Britain, the Socialist Society of Peter Taft, would then be free to fight out on an ideological basis for support within this wider framework. That's certainly what the model I would have. In other words, once again, the Labour Party shouldn't be seen exactly as an ideological party. It should be seen as a framework or a kind of workers' parliament within which parties should fight it out. But ultimately, to have a revolution, the Communist Party, whatever its name is, and whatever sort of coalition it's made up of, has to come to the fore and provide the far-sighted leadership, without which, of course, a revolution won't be consummated. So there's no contradiction between seeing the Labour Party as a framework, as a kind of parliament. It doesn't mean that you turn it into a revolutionary party. There's no contradiction between seeing it as this framework and at the same time thinking that we need a communist party. I certainly think we need a communist party, absolutely, but it has to be a revolutionary communist party, it has to be an internationalist communist party, and its fundamental basis has to be science. I want to just pick up where I can find disagreements, because they're always helpful, they help clarify things. So Peter was disagreeing with me on the question of legality. And he was saying that the Queen in Parliament organising a coup or being advised by generals or the bankers to organise, to disperse an elected Labour government, it would be legal. Yeah, in their terms it would be legal. Of course it would be illegal. And so we can say, yeah, okay, in their terms it's legal. They make the law and all that, and it's legal. And we would then say it's illegitimate because that's, from our standpoint, illegitimate. But Peter, I think you'd agree with me that we want what they say to be legal to be rather quickly made illegal, don't we? We want to illegalise, we want to make illegal any coup in the name of the monarchy against an elected Labour government. So, just using the word illegitimate for too long might be not all that helpful, because I would say this has got to be illegal, we're going to make it illegal. How do you make it illegal? Well, obviously you resist the coup by all means necessary, and I have to say I totally agree with you about violence. I mean, as the Charters said in 1848, peaceably if we've got to take power, peaceably if we may, forcibly if we must. Clearly it would have to be forcibly if the other side are preventing us from taking power, as we would say we have every legal right to once we've got a majority party. If they try to prevent us from taking power by using force, we have to use force, there's no question about that. And we have to be absolutely clear, we're not Gandhians, we're not going to lie down and die on the grounds that we'd then be martyrs and maybe the bourgeoisie would be sorry and all the rest of it. There's no question about that point. But I just wanted to say, we have to make what they deem legal, illegal. And so just using the word illegitimate seems to me fine. I agree as a description it's probably right. As a description, constitutionally, the Queen would be legal, but we have to move beyond that and through some kind of coercive resistance make sure that actually those people get locked up for organising what we regard as a illegitimate and then, in our terms, illegal attempted coup against democracy. Possibly, from my point of view, the most interesting conflict or disagreement, which is all very healthy, by the way. I think even in a democratic centralist organisation, I don't know how democratic centralist you really are here. Anyway, we definitely want debate and discussion and disagreement. So I totally disagree with Phil, and I totally agree with Stan and John on the question of whether you can transform the Labour Party into a revolutionary party. So Phil, you were saying we want to make chalk into cheese. And I just think, well, what's the point of it? I mean, if you've got a Labour Party, and you also want a Communist Party, why turn the Labour Party into the Communist Party? I mean, to me, it makes no sense. And as Stan and others have said, and John has said, the Labour Party should be pluralist. I think people who are not exactly Bolshevik have every right to be in a big party of the working class. And also, we need a healthy disagreement and debate, which would disappear if we just simply said, right, we're the Communist Party, and then nobody who disagrees with that line is allowed to be in the Labour Party. So, seems to me what you'd have if you insisted that the Labour Party is turned into the Communist Party. You then have a democratic centralist Labour Party. It's like having a democratic centralist Soviet, to me. I don't know, why would you want that? We need debate, we need disagreement, we need parliament, we need a forum within which all strands of the working class can thrash things out. So I totally disagree with the idea that we should even advocate turning the Labour Party into a revolutionary party, which would mean turning it into the Communist Party. The Communist Party should be democratic centralist in my view, and it's a totally different concept. But then the idea that what was interesting was a little bit of a debate now between maybe John and Phil. So I think, Phil, correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that if the Labour Party under Jeremy were to win a majority in Parliament, we would kind of sit there. Sorry?
It might be a good idea to stay in opposition.
So you're saying we would have? I'm listening to you, and I'm trying to sympathise, and I'm just trying to picture to myself the response of all the people that have gone to so much trouble to get the Labour Party elected under Jeremy Corbyn. We've finally done it, and we've got a majority in Parliament, and then Jeremy just sits there and lets the bosses.
There are masses outside Parliament as well. People inside Parliament.
That's right, but you're saying sit there in the sense of continue to allow the bourgeoisie, the Tories, the Lib Dems, the Queen in Parliament to carry on running the place, even though we've got a majority in Parliament. We take office but not power. Well, that's the same thing. You're allowing all the wars, all the austerity, all the attacks on jobs, all the homelessness to carry on, even though we've got a majority in Parliament. I mean, come on. Surely the better position is John's position. I'm not trying to butt him up, John. You can buy me a drink afterwards or whatever. But I mean, if there is a distinction between our Labour Party and their Labour Party, clearly. But I'm not quite sure, John, I understand what you mean, because it is a bit of a fuzzy area, isn't it? Would you say that if Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party and John McDonnell's Labour Party, and you've got criticism of Jeremy Corbyn and John, just as I have, I mean, they did wobble and all sorts of things, including Ireland and all sorts of things. So, would you say that Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell's Labour Party qualified as, quote, our Labour Party if we had a majority in Parliament? I think you are saying that. When you say our Labour Party, I don't think you're saying a communist Labour Party, are you? Okay, it's a difficult area, isn't it? So, but what I'm arguing from the history of the Russian Revolution is that even if it was not entirely our Labour Party, so that supposing Jeremy Corbyn is not a Bolshevik, supposing John McDonnell is not a Bolshevik, and supposing we've still got Tom Watson or people around there, I would say even under those circumstances, in order for us to get into a position to take power, we'd have to confront those people with a demand to break from the monarchy, to break from the bankers, to break from the bourgeoisie, and take power, and then be in a position to say, right, if you're not going to do it, it's over to us. Maybe, as you would say, Phil, on an ex-parliamentary basis, but still, if you're not going to take the power, what's the point of being in office? What's the point of people voting for you, putting you up there if you're not going to take power? So I'm saying that it's an interesting point that there's a distinction between our Labour Party and theirs, but it's also fuzzy. And I think in order to make it our Labour Party, we'd probably be obliged to confront the other lot with a demand take the power, which, by the way, happens to be what the Bolsheviks did in the Russian situation. Is that it? Have I left out anything? I'll just say what's so exciting at the moment is that we have. It's like this is. I don't think this has ever happened before certainly in the Labour Party. We've had moments. We've had we had the general strike. We've had councils of action in 20 and so on. But this is something rather different. And what we see now is the beginning of the building of a social movement. And probably, even though you can do what I did and try to sort of put sort of Trotsky spectacles on to sort of translate from the Russian Revolution to today, I also agree with comrades in the room who've said that probably our models are a little bit inadequate. And one of the reasons why they're probably inadequate is because, as I think it was John who was saying, in the Russian situation in 1917 you had extremely bad, extremely difficult, very slow and unreliable communication. And now we've got Twitter and Facebook and the internet. And things can go viral very, very quickly. And clearly there's something about the Jeremy Corbyn thing which, to an extent, it does depend on the authenticity, that the fact that you can believe the guy, but it also depends on the fact that you can put up little videos and they go all over the place very, very quickly. And in fact, they're not even confined to this country. They can go across the world pretty quickly. So that we're just getting to the position where, with any luck, and it may be a few years, and I'm not at all thinking we're going to necessarily have an election next year, or even that we want an election next year. I totally agree that we want an election when we're more likely to win it. But it's just possible that whereas the rest of Europe is moving, most of Europe moving to the right, in this country we're moving to the left. Let's hope so. But if that's true, whatever happens in this country certainly won't remain in this country. The communications are actually very good now. And the prospects of a massive, profound social change in this country with immediate repercussions across Europe are looking good, I would say. I mean, they're certainly a lot better than they have been. And I would also agree with comrades who've, in the Weekly Worker articles, you've always said, be wary of taking office without power. Look at Syriza. I couldn't agree more. And there may be a case for trying to avoid the full conquest of power until we're a little bit more confident that we could do that on a synchronized basis across at least Europe, or most of Europe, if not the whole planet. I mean, waiting for the whole planet to be ready probably is a bit ambitious. But there is certainly a very good case for making sure, if insofar as we can't obviously do that, we can't control events that much. But I mean, we do have such good communications now, in terms of the internet, the electronic, digital stuff, which people my children's age and my grandchildren's age are far more familiar with than I am. Possibly we have a chance of sort of building up a movement with enough time to ensure that when and if we do conquer full state power in this country, we are able to synchronize that action, at least across several countries of Western Europe, instead of being stuck in one United Kingdom where, obviously things would very rapidly change, go pear-shaped unless the revolution was immediately extending it across and becoming an international insurrection. Thanks.